Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Legendary actor and director Clint Eastwood once said, "Winning the election is a good news, bad news kind of thing. Okay, now you're the mayor. The bad news is, now you're the mayor." Politics is indeed a tumultuous gig to be working, and one that's fraught with trepidation and danger. And it can be a whole lot worse for the public at large. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We have a very special show for you today with a lot of in-depth analysis and hopefully more than a little fun, discussing midterms, polling, politics, and a whole lot more. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Great Falls, Montana on KQDI 1450 AM and 97.5 FM. We thank you for taking the time to tune in. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. We're just a few weeks out from the midterm elections that are going to shape not just the policy for the next 2 years and beyond, but perhaps even the very fabric of America. Amid the hue and cry of politicos and pundits lie the pollsters and their precarious wares. Are they offering a glimpse of the future or a vanity-packed roadmap to a desired outcome? Well, we're extremely lucky today to be joined by the best husband and wife duo since Mr. and Mrs. Smith, with less martial arts and more political analysis. Hopefully, Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donner, and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, who also happens to be longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner.
I'll give you an evaluation of the Mr. and Mrs. Smith sing a thing offline, Mark.
Absolutely. We'll put it in the blooper reels, like Burt Reynolds and Dom DeLuise. Now, let's start with the broader picture. We're going to defy polite custom and ask the gentleman first on this one. Tim, there's more than 450 races taking place this November 8th. How many of them actually matter?
Well, in the House, there's about 35 seats that are considered to be toss-ups. In the Senate, there's about 8. And basically in the House, it's hard to envision the Republicans not taking over control. It's just a matter of to what degree. In the Senate, the critical races really come down to Georgia, Pennsylvania, Nevada, New Hampshire. These are all considered toss-up states, in Ohio as well, now that a new poll has shown J.D. Vance to have fallen into a tie. So the Senate seat, the Senate control is, as I wrote a few weeks back, is on a knife's edge. The House, not so much, but I do sense that after a late summer surge in which Joe Biden got some legislation passed and was able to put a few things up on the board, that his popularity in the Democrats increased a bit, but I sense that it's turning back the other way now, and that the GOP is going to do better than we thought a couple of weeks ago, mostly because of the key issues that people are going to vote on. And it's not going to be abortion, climate change, and tax increases and student loan payoffs. It's going to be the economy and inflation and crime and the border and the sense of chaos. And I think the closer we get to the election, the better that's going to make Republicans look, especially since they've now released this commitment to America, which has all the right key hot button poll tested buzzwords in it to appeal to those in the center and right of center.
Tim, can I just take you back for 1 second to the Ohio race that you mentioned? I'm sort of interested because I was listening to an interview by Robert Cahaley, the founder of the Trafalgar Group polling firm. They've got a really good track record. And he was saying, everybody wants to make Ohio a swing state. He said, Ohio is really no longer a swing state.
It isn't.
And,
it isn't.
And so do you think the polling on the Vance race is maybe not as tight as they're saying it is?
Trump won Ohio by 8 points in both 2016 and 2020. It's not a swing state anymore. It would be, even though the polls have tightened there, I'd be shocked if J.D. Vance lost that race. If he does, it would signal that the Republicans most likely would not, could not gain control of the Senate.
You know, I was actually, as I was reading, and I do this so you don't have to. I was reading a CNN article earlier today. Yeah, somebody has to do it. Somebody actually has to go on that site and read it. But one of the columns on there was suggesting that people in these key races, and it mentioned Ohio and J.D. Vance, they're not spending money on television ads. Why do you think that is, Lisa?
Oh, that's interesting, Mark. I wasn't aware of that. But that sort of makes sense because a lot of people are getting their news from other places, namely the internet, like places like Liberty Nation. You know, more and more that's happening. And plus it's easy to really mute those commercials and buzz through them on television if you have a DVR or if you watch on, say, YouTube or streaming, that kind of thing. So that sort of makes sense. I mean, Tim is really, he goes way back to his days at Syracuse Newhouse Communication School, and they talked about the power of TV advertising. But I think it's just moving venues. They still take the video and the commercial, but they put it on different places.
Yes, they're able to target it quite a bit better than they used to. Because the thing is, if you think about it, when you put an ad on TV, 80% maybe or 90% of the people either aren't paying attention or can't be persuaded or have already made up their mind. Whereas with internet advertising, you can target it much more precisely to the demographic groups that you need to win in order to, to be victorious in the race.
Yeah, this is interesting because we're often told by those in the bastions of the Fourth Estate that it's the Democratic Party that are the ones who are superb at campaigning. They're the ones who are the cutting edge of campaigns. We heard this from the Obama days all the way through to today. But it seems that the Republicans, if they're targeting more towards the internet and forgoing ad buys on television, surely that's a switch around from where it used to be, right?
Well, I think, again, it's the micro-targeting capacity of campaigns now to be able to spend their money the most efficiently. TV advertising is no longer the most efficient, but I sense that when we get close to the time of November 8th, which is Election Day, that we'll see more of that bulk advertising, probably designed to incite greater turnout.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's what I was thinking. They really need to get their turnout.
Lisa, speaking of turnout, we've heard a lot about, you kind of avoided the discussions recently on the red wave coming or the red tsunami. And this seems to be happening on both sides. If you follow the more left-leaning media, it's, there's a blue wave coming. There's a blue tsunami coming. But which one's right? What's the zeitgeist in the country at the moment? Is it really just people putting wishful thinking in there?
Okay, let's face it. Turnout is mostly determined by the issues. And so what are the issues? Before the landmark ruling of Dobbs, which ended Roe v. Wade, Republicans were coming out in full force. And so what the Democrats were thinking is, now they've got the edge. But Rasmussen just did a poll, and they broke down the electorate by party identification, and they said 64% of Republicans say they're very excited about the midterms, compared to 56% of Democrats who say they're very excited about the midterms. And that wasn't taken in a September poll. But before the landmark ruling, for sure, Republicans were coming out in much larger numbers to the primaries. After the landmark ruling, it tightened up. More Democrats came up, but still the Republicans are leading. So in terms of voter turnout, the Republicans have the edge.
Later in the show, we talk liberties, death by 1,000 cuts. But after this short break, we're back with Tim and Lisa Donner, crunching the midterm numbers. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Tim and Lisa Donner discussing midterms and polling. As Tim, based on your analysis here and based on the enthusiasm divide that Lisa's just mentioned, what kind of numbers do you think we can see with seats changing hands?
Well, I think it's realistic for the Republicans to expect to pick up 20 to 25 seats in the House. The number was higher than that, but I do think that post-Roe enthusiasm on the left might cut into that margin because there's been a steep increase in women registering to vote across the country. That's going to cut the margins down in the House. I think they'd be happy to take 20 seats or 25. I think it's a matter of somewhere in there would be my guess. In terms of the Senate, the most I see Republicans doing is gaining 2 seats. That would be the upside. They could also lose a couple of seats. I think a lot of that really depends on, I mentioned earlier about Pennsylvania. Wisconsin is also in play. The Democrats actually leading the incumbent Ron Johnson there. And in Georgia, who knows what to expect there because Herschel Walker was way down. He was down in double digits. Now it's basically a dead heat with a lot depending on the single debate between Walker and the incumbent, who of course is Raphael Warnock, who got elected in 2020. So I see a pickup, and if I see a pickup for Republicans clearly in the House, and that they take control, if only because that always happens in midterms. The party out of power takes control of the House or gains a ton of seats. The Senate, Mitch McConnell was right. A lot of it does depend on the quality of the candidates, and I think Dr. Oz and Herschel Walker, in particular in Pennsylvania and Georgia, respectively, are the people that, if they can win, the Republicans will take the Senate.
Let me just interject one thing, and that is, if we're looking at Trafalgar, apparently Walker is pulling ahead, and Oz is now within the margin of error. So I think these two are gaining, but you said 2 seats might come to the Republicans. What 2 do you think those are?
Well, I think it's looking really good in Nevada, where Paul Laxalt is holding, I wouldn't say a commanding lead, but a solid lead, and he's been ahead from the beginning. He's
got a good name recognition as well.
Yeah, and the Republican governor candidate for governor looks really solid.
I'd say Nevada looks like a solid choice for a pickup for Republicans. I'm not sure about New Hampshire. I just don't know what to make of those people. They say live free or die, and then they vote for Democrats. So what can you say? I think Georgia...
It's a New England thing, and you wouldn't understand.
If I can interject on that, Scott D. Cosenza, who will be joining us later for our Talking Liberty segment, he says that people in this area of the woods, the New Hampshire, they like to have statewide Democrats, but they like to have a Republican governor just so it doesn't go too crazy and affect their taxes.
And that's true with Massachusetts, too, which is far to the left of New Hampshire, but often has elected a Republican governor because they want to be able to stand and signal their virtue with all these left-wing positions that lead to fiscal recklessness. But by electing a Republican, they can make sure that they don't have to pay for all the things that they actually support.
I'm just going to take issue with one thing that you said, Tim. Not that wives have ever disagreed with their husbands.
There's a first time for everything.
Ever.
Breaking news here on Liberty Nation. Right. A wife about to disagree with her husband.
But, I'm not really sure that the abortion debate is going to have that much of an impact. Because if it was, when Rasmussen took the survey, they surveyed on abortion, crime, immigration, and climate change. They stayed out of economic factors, which is interesting because you have to figure inflation and all that goes strictly across the board. So what's driving you to the polls? If there were that many women and that many people that were really wanted to vote on the abortion issue, I don't think you'd have 64% of the Republicans saying they were very excited and 56% of the Democrats. And also you have to look at the pro-life people too. That decision is going to bring out that group as well.
Well, I think there was a 15-point gap in energy about the election between Republicans and Democrats before the Dobbs decision. Now it's down to single digits. So there's still an enthusiasm gap, but it doesn't favor the Republicans as much as it did before. I think abortion is an issue that's a big spring and summer issue because you're far away from the election and you're thinking bigger thoughts. But when it gets closer to the election, political behavior generally says that voters are focused on core issues, and that means economic and safety and security issues, not on climate change and abortion. So I think it's going to still diminish a little bit more abortion as an issue as we approach November 8th.
As you point out there, Tim, that abortion is not polling as high as other issues. But do you think perhaps that you have some people who are very, very pro-abortion, pro-choice, that are actually going to stay home despite the opportunity that they might have to end up with a codified version of Roe v. Wade because of the enormous drag factor of Joe Biden? Because he's really not very popular. And pretty much everything, he seems to have the anti-Midas touch, as in everything he touches turns to manure. Lisa,
in other words, do you see this as sort of a referendum? This election is sort of a referendum on Biden, Tim, or not?
Well, it's interesting because the Democrats are trying to turn it into a referendum on Donald Trump. Even though
I wrote an article on this.
Yes,
Who is the referendum on?
It's true.
They can't stop themselves.
It's a referendum on a guy
on.
that isn't president. So, they're trying. Look, if they really thought they had a good shot to win control of Congress or maintain control of Congress, Joe Biden would not be out there patently insulting and scandalizing 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump last time. It's a desperation move. And I think it's one that's going to backfire big time on him, just like the student loan thing, which I thought it was really interesting, Lisa. You talk about Trafalgar, the same man that you discussed said that he's never seen such a negative reaction to something as he has to this student loan bailout.
Well, I'm going to give you credit where credit is due, because you wrote an article saying this whole student loan thing is going to backfire on Biden. I wasn't really sure I thought maybe you were going out on a limb, but you were right. I mean, everybody, and now the CBO is coming out with real cost estimates. People are starting to freak out, and now they're talking about, legal issues, that this is just so flagrantly in violation of the Constitution.
It is.
It's a 400 billion price tag, apparently. You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. Remember, you can tune into LN Radio from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. We'll be talking the slow demise of the Constitution later in the show with our Talking Liberty segment. But after this short break, we're coming back with Tim and Lisa Dunham to discuss the activist pollsters and poll takers. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're back with Lisa and Tim Donner, the dynamic duo, discussing the impending midterms and the activist pollsters. Lisa, we keep talking about this interview with the founder of Trafalgar, and I really want to dive into this because I did a read-up of it, but I didn't actually watch the interview. But I believe he said something about how well polls are done depending on their length. Could you tell me about that?
Well, he I think put it more succinctly than anyone who I've ever heard do it, and he does it in this sort of backward sort of Southern drawl, Georgia Southern drawl, but it's really a charming delivery. But he says, are these polls really trying to affect the electorate or reflect the electorate?
It's a brilliant statement.
It is. And I think more and more, if they were trying to reflect the electorate, his point was they should all be fired. I mean, mostly because they've been getting it wrong, many, many elections over. But the fact that they haven't been getting fired, they haven't been changing this, maybe what the point he's making is maybe what they're really trying to do is to affect the election. And in other words, they use the poll as a narrative rather than, because a lot of things happen via poll information. For instance, Where should you put your party apparatchiks? Where should you put your heavy donors? What, all these decisions are made. Is a really bad poll going to keep voter turnout down? Do you want voter turnout down in the election? So in other words, they're doing what's called push polling. I call it fake polling. But to get back to your questionnaires, when somebody calls you up, Mark, even if they're on your cell phone, and they tell you they want to take a poll and it's 40 questions, what's your answer going to be?
Not a chance. Never going to happen. Ask me one and be done.
Click. The answer is click. And so what Trafalgar is doing, and I think a lot of other pollsters who really want to reflect the electorate are going to be doing more and more of, is they do like 7 or 8 questions, In other words, people are willing to sit for 7 or 8 questions. And then you have to ask yourself, who are those people that are willing to sit for the 40 questions?
Well, you say 40 questions.
Activists.
Yeah.
Activists, retired people, lonely people. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. Non-busy people.
Not a precise demographic to reflect the general electorate. In 2020, Mark and Lisa, you may recall this. In October of 2020, there was a poll released, and I believe it was one of the networks. It was either NBC or ABC. In Wisconsin, had Biden leading by 17 points. 17 points, and he wound up winning by about half a percentage point. So that reflects what you say, Liz, that this stuff is designed to basically to disengage Republicans who think that it's hopeless. They become demoralized. They see polls like this. And they figure, what's the point of showing up? That could have made a difference in Wisconsin in 2020. But I think the other point about polls is in 2016, they took a lot of heat because they got the winner wrong. They said it would be Clinton and it was Trump. In 2020, they didn't take as much heat because they predicted Biden and Biden won. However, overlooked in all this was most of those polls were saying that Biden was going to win by about 7 points. And in fact, he won by 3.5. So they were just as inaccurate, honestly, as 2016, but they didn't take the heat because they ultimately picked the person who won.
There's a couple of interesting points about polls that I find fascinating, and I hope you and the listeners will as well. For example, I was reading a YouGov Ipsos poll this morning, and it was over. I read the crosstabs again, so you don't have to. Although right. I know that that's one of Lisa's guilty pleasures.
Yes,
but it was more than 80 questions. Now, the kind of people who answer those things, as you pointed out, these are non-busy people, but they're also activists. And I don't know if you know this. I'm sure you do. But I find an interesting factor is that some people, when they start doing a poll, they will give the opposite party affiliation. So, for example, if they're a Republican, they'll say they're a Democrat. If they're a Democrat, they'll say they're a Republican, or they'll say they're independent. And then what they'll do is they'll give the answers that a straight Democrat, for example, would give, or that a straight Republican would give, but by aligning themselves with the opposite party. So it runs the numbers either way. And they're doing this because essentially they're activists in their minds. They're legends in their lunchtimes, as we like to say in the UK. But I find that an interesting facet. And by having a poll that really just focuses on 5, 6, 7 questions, you're more likely to get a genuine answer. And I think that's probably, that's where we want polling to be, right? We want the genuine tools so we can statistically analyze them and figure out where things are going. Is that too much to ask?
Well, it's interesting that you brought up the YouGov poll, because what happens is that the pollster needs to adjust for the fake responses. One of the things Cahaley was saying in the interview is that people often give 2 lies in every, one is how much money did they make? They either overestimate or underestimate. And the other one is their party affiliation. They'll say they're Democrat when they're Republican, or they say they're Republican when they're Democrat, or they say they're independent when they voted Democrat the last 8 elections. And what they're pulling, their polling outfit does is they dig into, and the other thing you have to pay attention to is this poll likely voters or registered voters? Likely
That's the
voters are
important
people who have actually gone to the polls, or maybe, recently, relatively recently. Registered voters are just, they're registered to vote. I mean, but maybe they haven't been, voting in the last 4 cycles. You're much better off with likely voters and then digging in, looking at how did they vote the last 8 times. Republican, are they saying they're an independent, but they voted Republican the last 8 times? It's absurd.
It
Well,
is.
there's the thing is about these polls trying to put together all the demographics. You have the added factor now of massive mail-in voting, which makes registered voters, it seems to me, more likely to become likely voters because it takes a lot less effort than standing in line. I don't think we're going to see how this whole mail-in ballot thing is going to completely flesh out over time until 2024 is over. But of course, the Democrats want as much mail-in voting as possible, and the Republicans want the least amount possible because they feel, and this was the Carter Commission back in 2005, after the 2004 election, pinpointed mail-in voting as the greatest potential source of fraud of any kind of voting.
Well, actually, it's funny, here in Europe, there's most countries ban mail-in voting for precisely that reason. So we've discussed what issues we think will be most prevalent towards the 2022 elections and the 2024 elections and beyond. But do you think that Joe Biden and his party can pivot towards those in the short time that they have left? Or won't they bother? This one's open to both of you.
Yeah.
I think they're going to pivot away from progressive issues because they realize how toxic they are. They went in full steam on wokeness in 2020, and they're paying a huge price for it now. You see the results of people being freed after violent crimes in New York, for example. This is really, really bad optics for the Democrats. I think the progressives are in the process of crashing and burning because their ideas are so impractical, and they also are dangerous. And I think people are realizing it more and more, that just letting people out of prison and throwing trillions of dollars at problems is no way to go through life. Just like fat,
drunk, and stupid is no way to go through life.
Yes, exactly.
The great National Lampoon movie,
Yes.
Animal House. So,
Lisa Donna, we'll give you the last word.
Tim, if what you say is right, that women are going to be coming out in droves in this election, then I do see one progressive issue as perhaps taking a nosedive, and that is the issue of schools. I think when you start messing with children, mothers get riled up. And, there's a lot going on in the school systems now in the United States, and there's a lot of parents that are really riled up about it. And I think this is one area that really could go against the progressives.
It already is,
my
as we
thought.
saw from, it already is, as we
Glenn
saw
Youngkin.
with Glenn Youngkin in Virginia.
Exactly.
He won that race almost exclusively
Exactly.
on that issue.
Lisa K. Donna, Tim Donna, thanks ever so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
After this short break, we'll be right back with Scott Cassenta discussing liberty's death by 1,000 cuts. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Liberty comes and liberty goes, sometimes in big wars, but more often by the death by 1,000 cuts. We're talking liberty today on just a few of those thin slices with constitutional attorney, host of the Uprising podcast, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, and the founder of All Things of Brilliance and Bourbon, Mr. Scott D. Cassenta, Esquire. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Well, with an intro like that, we can't go wrong, Mark. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
That's why I
Always
keep
pleasure.
doing them. We keep bringing you back.
Yeah.
So this first slice of life that I want to talk about, Scott, it's about how the mayor of Philadelphia has decided to, well, as far as I can tell, circumvent the Second Amendment. What are the details? And more importantly, how unconstitutional is it?
Sadly, in the city of
City
my
of brotherly
birth
love.
and of brotherly love and of the cradle of liberty, as I like to call it, Mark, they have had a generation-long campaign against the Second Amendment, not advertised as such, as you might imagine, but just practically speaking.
It wouldn't fit on the bumper sticker.
And I say that as somebody who is very familiar with the city's attempts to frustrate the Second Amendment as a former resident of that state and gun enthusiast. So, and
a member of the bar in said state as well.
That's true. Yes, this particular affront is it's one of these things that really, I think the legal analysis pales in comparison to the political analysis. And that's because what they've done, Mark, is said that they're banning guns in public parks in the city, and they're going to put signage up to that effect. This is in the wake of the tragic murder of a young woman who worked at a park rec center who was killed by basically crossfire from neighborhood criminals, and one of them was 14 years old. So not persons who were carrying, as you might imagine, with this law will affect legal gun owners who you might want in those parks, by the way, because what we do know is that when lawful gun owners carry, we see a safety benefit and a crime reduction. That's what the data shows us.
Yeah, so 2.5 million defensive uses per year, according to the CDC, I believe.
Yeah, so what this is going to do is just keep the law-abiding people out of the park. We presume that the 14-year-old who was involved in the shooting that led to the death of the park worker, whose name escapes me sadly, we don't suspect that he would look at the signage and think, I'm 14, I'm already carrying a gun when I'm not allowed to have a gun at all, much less carry one, and maybe I'll just turn back because of this signage. I think that just me announcing that demonstrates how preposterous it is, right? So all it's going to do, once again, is keep law-abiding people out of parks. And you mentioned in the lead-up, is it unconstitutional? Well, likely it is, given the Bruin case that the Supreme Court handed down in 2022. I see you want to...
I do have a question there, Scott. Am I right in thinking that Philadelphia, specifically doing this, they're going beyond what is presently legal within the state of Pennsylvania, and is that therefore?
Yeah, let me cut in and I know where you're headed with that. Yeah. And so what many states have had and do have is something called preemption with respect to firearms laws, which is that because of the meddling nature of every little hamlet and burg in a state wanting to weigh in on national issues like whether it's guns or abortions, and they say, you may not legislate in this area because we're going to do it at the state level. But what gun opponents, gun grabbers like to do, Mark, to a great effect, is remove those preemption regulations or laws so that everyone can frustrate the will of people to carry firearms. And as you might imagine, it becomes untenable to do so. If you don't know, if you're walking from from your town to 2 towns away, what all the regulations might be in the midst. So it's a great way to kind of frustrate the expression of the right to keep and bear arms. In Virginia, where I now live, there was preemption, and then the Democrats took over and they removed preemption for the purpose of frustrating firearms carry. But all of those preemption things, I predict, Mark, will fall once the challenge to them gets to the Supreme Court, because the Bruin decision, I think, makes those laws unconstitutional.
Okay, so am I right in thinking, you mentioned earlier that it's the politics of it that's possibly more interesting, because this kind of thing, making certain areas of a city or a town gun-free zones, I mean, we've seen that quite recently in New York. This is something we're seeing quite a lot of.
Mark, I speak weekly to, I would say, at least 3 different Philadelphians, none of whom are Republicans or are gun enthusiasts or gun carriers, family members and close friends of mine, who are, to a person, terrified of the security situation in Philadelphia. And I think this is only about trying to throw a sop to them, especially the ones who won't examine the likely effect of the law with a lot of critical thinking, in just a bid to say, hey, we're doing something here to try to make you safer in a city that is anything but.
Well, it seems that they're aiming to be seen to be doing something rather than actually doing something. Because as you point out, a 14-year-old and a young lady getting caught in the crossfire, that's likely, almost certainly, in fact, definitely, I feel like I'm on the Muppet Show, one of the hecklers in the balcony, an illegal firearm or illegally possessed firearm. And this law does...
You can be Stadler and I'll be Waldorf.
That's right. I couldn't remember their names. But that gun was almost certainly legal anyway, and therefore this law will do nothing.
It's not legal for a 14-year-old in the United States of America to carry a pistol anywhere, anytime. I mean, maybe there's a hunting thing if they're actually like with a parent or something. Okay,
and a bear comes.
Yeah.
But so the law will actually do nothing to prevent the crime for which it's been crafted. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh,
the law will do nothing for
the
crime for which it's crafted.
Yes.
Okay, so it's virtue signaling.
Yes.
Oh, well, there we go. Why didn't you just say so at the beginning, Scott? New laws, liberties, death by 1,000 cut. It's virtue signaling. It can be safely...
We could have trimmed it down to 102. You know, what I mean?
Cut it down to 305, as Billy Joel once sang.
Absolutely.
Now, also on our Liberty radar, Scott, it's a challenge to Joe Biden's signature student loan debt forgiveness scheme. Now, we don't have much time left on this segment, but I'd like to know: is this a serious challenge to the student debt forgiveness scheme?
Well, serious, and the problem is that there's going to be a standing issue that they're not likely to get passed. And when you say, is it serious, how I process that is it likely to proceed?
That's my intent behind the question. Yeah.
And I think the answer is no.
Okay. Why? Because of standing.
Yes, because you can't just file suit against something that the government did because you don't like it. That's not how it works. You have to have a particularized damage that the government has granted you permission to sue it. It's a sovereign. So the government's a sovereign, and it allows the citizenry to sue it under certain circumstances only, and those have been issued forth via statute. So there's a statute. There's a Federal Tort Claims Act, for instance. There are other acts that basically detail out when you can sue the government and for what reasons.
So the American taxpayer being on the hook for an estimated $400 billion is not reason enough to sue, or not a valid enough reason to sue in the eyes of the government.
Well, in the eyes of the people through their representatives, Mark, who have passed the law. So you have to put it out that way. Okay, well, that's an interesting thing. So is the administration likely to face suits that do have standing? And I guess my final question here attached to that is, will they just go ahead and do it anyway and then hope that the remedy that a court could offer becomes moot? I think the answer to that question is yes. We don't know for sure, but almost certainly that's how the government generally proceeds in all endeavors and administrations. They could just go ahead and proceed, and unless and until a court tells them to stop doing so, once the course of action has been charted, unless the court says, do not do this thing, you're ordered to. And even then, sometimes, as you know, as a man who reads the newspaper and produces it, but oftentimes it doesn't go that way. So that's what I expect to have happen here. The federal government with their Jinsu knives taking one slice of liberty at a time. Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much. Cheers, Mark. Thank you. And that's almost all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to thank our guests, Tim Donner and Lisa K. Donner, and Scott D. Cosenza for taking the time to join us. And my thanks to you, the listeners, from coast to coast for tuning in. My final thoughts for this week. I'll leave you with a simple quote from the immortal Otto von Bismarck, who said, quote, "People never lie so much as after a hunt, during a war, or before an election," end quote. And there's really something to think about there, folks. Keep your eyes and your mind open. You never know who's trying to pull a fast one. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.